Thanks for clicking. My name is Mark Mitchell. I'm a mortgage broker here in London, Ontario. This week, Stats Canada released its GDP data showing that our economy actually shrunk in the past few months by 0.7%. This came as a shock to most observers, as usually when you think that you have high inflation, it's going to be accompanied by higher GDP growth. This was not the case. In what's being called the worst of both worlds by BMO economist Douglas Porter, we're actually seeing inflation go up and up and up, and it's not being accompanied by high economic growth. This actually has another term, not called the worst of both worlds. It's called stagflation. So what I want to do in this video is go through the run-up to this GDP data that was just released, why it's a problem when we were all expecting the problem to be inflation, and go through what is stagflation and why it was such an issue in the 1970s and 80s, and then offer some concluding remarks as to what we might be in store for in the future, but which will matter both for interest rates and real estate prices. Speaking of interest rates, we do have a rate announcement coming out from the Bank of Canada next week, and we'll have an update on that on this channel. Click like and subscribe to get those videos. But for now, let's talk about the run-up to the GDP data that was released this week. So up until the announcement this week that our GDP had contracted by 0.7%, most economists, most commentators, myself included, were expecting to have high inflation and higher GDP growth. We have gotten the high inflation, which was released a few weeks ago at 3.7%. But as we saw this week when StatsCan came out with the news that our GDP, our economy, had actually contracted by 0.7%, didn't even grow 1 or 2%, which wouldn't have been great. It contracted. So what we have now is high inflation and low economic growth, and that's not really supposed to happen. When that happens, not even low economic growth, we have economic reversal, economic shrinking. Our economy is getting smaller. That's not what you want to see when you have high inflation. The whole reason for allowing inflation to go high is to have that economic growth. So what's causing this? What we have when we have high inflation and low economic growth, higher sustained employment, which we also have, that is called stagflation, which is much more worse than inflation, and it's what we experienced in the 1970s and early 1980s, leading to the creation of the misery index, if that gives you any indication of what stagflation is. So, in the 1970s, when we had the oil shocks, when oil prices went through the roof, absolutely skyrocketed, we had a period of expanded inflation that was not accompanied by high economic growth. That creates a big problem for policymakers. In normal times, when you have high inflation, you're going to have high economic growth. So you can raise interest rates to tamp down that inflation. It'll tamp down the growth as well, but since both are already high, you're okay. When you want to stimulate economic growth, you lower interest rates. You understand that the inflation is going to go up because you lowered the interest rates, but you're going to get that economic growth as well. So policymakers tend to target between 1 and 3% for both inflation and economic growth. And that brings us to our problem. When inflation is running very high at 3.7% that it is right now, while at the same time economic growth is contracting, our economy is shrinking, at that point there's only so much policymakers can do. If we lower interest rates to try to pump up that economy, well, inflation is going to run even hotter, which could bring the economy, which obviously higher inflation isn't being accompanied by higher economic growth. Also, at this point, since the economic growth is so low, you really don't want to raise rates, because if you raise rates, that's going to make the economy shrink even more. So, when we have next week's interest rate announcement, it's even more unlikely than it ever was, but it's even more unlikely than it was in the past couple years at least, that they're going to raise rates given this economic data. It's going to be very, very unlikely that they're going to raise rates because they really can't with our economy already shrinking. Given that, for the most part, the country has reopened, you really don't want to see shrunken economic growth. What they're showing, what the data seems to be revealing, is that a slowdown in real estate is actually largely responsible for that slowdown in economic growth. It was widely held that real estate was maintained a large portion of our GDP throughout the lockdowns for the past year and a half. So as that's slowing down, our economy is slowing down along with it. What that means is that the rest of the sectors of our economy aren't strong enough to make up for what's being lost in real estate over the summer months. So really what this data is showing us is that the economy isn't as strong as we really would have hoped for, and we can probably expect to see prolonged lower interest rates as we start to see what everything looks like. I've been saying for months, and the past year, when asked what I think rates are going to happen, is that nobody knows, and anyone that tells you what's going to happen with rates is most likely lying to you. And I think this GDP data just backs that up, because nobody was really expecting us to have a shrunken GDP and for the rest of the economy to be as weak as it is. Now, is it time to panic just yet? I don't think not just yet. This was just one release of our GDP indicators. We're still waiting for the next few months to see what inflation is at over those few months, and what happens when the next GDP indicators come out in a few months. So, we still don't have all the data, but if we do continue to see high inflation and low growth, or not even low growth, economic retraction, and we continue to see the expansion of the money supply with no economic growth to accompany it, then we are in a period of stagflation, much like the 70s and 80s, and we're going to have to look and see what kind of policies are available at that time to get things back to a sort of a normalized position. Unfortunately, there are similarities between the 1970s and right now, where an external shock, OPEC and the rising oil prices, are causing a massively weak economy throughout the world, really, as there's been supply disruptions. Sound familiar? But, like I said, it's not time to panic yet. Even with BMO saying it's the worst of all worlds. With that said, it's a good idea to keep an eye on interest rates and the economy, as if stagflation does hit. My prediction is they will raise interest rates because they're not going to let inflation get out of control. I don't think that anybody wants hyperinflation. I don't think that the central banks will allow that to happen, because the populace just would not stand for it. But only time will tell. As more data comes out with the GDP and the inflation and interest rates, mortgages, and real estate, we will have more videos out as the data comes out. So thanks so much for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.